Okay, maybe we'll get started. I see most are here. Hello, everybody. My name is Moberly Luker, and welcome to our workshop, Ungrading Student Presentations. I am assistant professor of teaching in the Department of English Language and Literatures, and I'm also the chair of the Coordinated Arts program. I'm joining you today from my home on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I'm joined by my co-presenter, Craig.
Hi, everyone. My name's Craig Stansford. I'm currently an instructor at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and until very recently, I was a graduate PhD student at UBC in the Department of English there as well, but I'm just finished and graduated. I'm on vacation right now in Nova Scotia, so I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq people today.
So I will give you our plan for the session. It's just a 1 hour session today, so we'll hopefully be able to get all of our plans in. So we are starting with this introduction and our agenda here. We're going to do a little warm up with a Jamboard just to get a sense of your perspective on the topic that we're talking about, your investment, your questions. Then we have a presentation to share based on our research that we've been doing. So our point of view on the topic around assessing student speaking, why and how we're moving toward a critical and equitable approach to assessment. Then we're going to open it up to discussion. We're not doing breakout rooms. I think some of you maybe will be happy to hear that, because I know that in our experience, sometimes it makes people, groan. So we thought we would just kind of have an open discussion, so an opportunity to reflect and critique together our sort of established practices around assessment. Then Craig and I are going to offer some new strategies that we've been trying in our classrooms for assessing oral presentations. And if all goes as planned, we should have time for picking up the discussion and answering any questions that come up throughout. So that is the plan. And we will dive now into the Jamboard. Basically, we are, oh, actually, you know what? I do. I'm sorry. I have a slide here that introduces both the Jamboard and its sort of premises. So the idea behind the Jamboard is to focus us around what the questions are that we have today, that the sort of topic, where you're coming from, inviting you to start to reflect on some of your sort of established practices around oral presentation, both in your discipline and in your classroom, and then begin also just to get a sense of like, what are you here to find out? What are you here to talk about? So Craig, we'll put the link to the Jamboard in the chat. If you've never used a Jamboard before, there's a little sort of basic guide here on the left of the screen. You can use the sticky note or the add text feature to write on the board and respond with your comments. There are 3 pages. The first page asks you to think about how you think about oral presentations in your discipline. The second one about your classroom. And the third one is sort of more for general questions. Feel free to answer 1, 2, or 3 pages. We'll give you time to kind of work through them, but you can start on page 3 if you prefer. As it says on the right of the slide, we'll use the Jamboard to collect these initial thoughts and perspectives and questions. But I want to sort of set that up with a few premises of what we're focusing the conversation. So the point of today's workshop is in part to examine and critique normative habits and expectations in our disciplines and classrooms. So really asking you to kind of begin at the beginning, and this is a safe space to sort of say, well, this is how we've always done it in my discipline, or this is what I realize I'm expecting of students. We are also acknowledging that everybody will have different both personal and disciplinary perspectives. Craig and I have been doing work on oral presentations and speaking with students for 2 years now, and we really see the range of ways that this works in different disciplines. And in fact, that's really important to the work that we're doing. And I also want to point out that we're primarily focusing on formal classroom speaking here, because that's what we're talking about in terms of the way that we're talking about assessment, like giving an assignment, assessing that assignment. And we'll know that those are really challenging to assess, and we know that students bring a lot of anxiety in particular to those. That doesn't mean that there aren't many, many ways that students speak in our classroom, like the small discussions, big discussions, and we can certainly bring that into the conversation. But for the purposes of this sort of premise, just to kind of put some parameters around the discussion a little bit, we're really thinking about those more formal presentations, even though we see how this relates to more informal presentations. So off we go. I'll give you a few minutes to just kind of write and reflect. And for those who just joined, we just put the link in the chat again to the Jamboard, and we'll just start there, and then we'll move into the discussion and the presentation. I have displayed the Jamboard now. If everybody can, is that Craig? Are you seeing the Jamboard on the? Yeah, okay, great. So we can sort of see it populate. And if you're just joining, I saw we just have one or two folks just joining now. We are at this Jamboard just doing some general first thoughts. So I see some answers populating here. There's a lot of them. It's just, I think one of the things we're interested in here is how we align or what some of the differences are between what we expect when we are in our disciplines and what we expect in the classroom. There's some interesting places where those come together or diverge. And I see some overlap, like clarity of speech is something that we're looking for in our disciplines and organization. And we see that kind of overlapping in the student slide here. Preparation. Interestingly, I think, when it comes to our assignments, we're focused more on things like preparation and interest, which maybe we take for granted in the disciplinary setting with colleagues. I really relate to this one about passion. Certainly, I think one criteria is like, it's painful when it feels painful for the student, and they seem that they want to just be anywhere but there. Just give you one more minute. I'm interested to know, sort of on that third slide, like things about scoring, rubrics, and grading, absolutely, and accessibility. So I see those popping up already, and those are some definitely things that we're going to cover. The challenge of assessing for large classrooms, that is a challenge, and that's actually something we don't have on our agenda to talk about, but we can open that up for discussion at the end if there's time, because I have some ideas about that, and maybe others in the room do as well. But I recognize that that's sort of a perpetual barrier, and I see someone else writing scaling is definitely a challenge. Okay, I will give you one more minute to write while I attempt to go back to the slides. And then we can come back to some of this in the discussion. Thank you so much. It's really interesting to see all of where you're coming from. And I think there's many different disciplines and perspectives in the room involving students in grading. Yeah, that's something that we talk about a lot, and that's talked about a lot in the literature around assessments, actually, is like self-grading and peer grading, peer evaluation. Okay. So I think we can just see the slides as they are. It's not the full display, but I think it's fine. So I'm going to, Craig and I are both going to now move into a sort of presentation component where we share with you the research that we've been doing and sort of how, from what perspective we are approaching this reassessment of assessment. So I will start, and I have some slides to share, and then I'll turn it over to Craig, and then we'll turn it back over to you. So I started working on pedagogies for scholarly speaking in 2018 when I realized that I didn't have any. I was teaching a first year introduction to literature and writing, and I was often assigning a presentation component with the research project. And I would spend the whole semester teaching research methods and writing strategies and editing and evaluating their essays based on course outcomes and everything we had learned in class. But then there was a presentation, and it just seemed like, well, this is a dynamic way for them to share their work. And also it's good for you to have practice presenting, right? And I didn't teach them anything about how to present, and I did not have rigorous plans for evaluating them. And when I began what turned out to be a TLEF project that produced this website that you're seeing on the slide here. So when I began that project, I held a focus group with colleagues, most of whom also taught writing and research courses. And many of them said the same things. Some of them said they didn't assign presentations because they didn't feel equipped to teach them. Some of them did, but didn't feel confident teaching or assessing them. And there were also a lot of barriers that came up actually that I see on the Jamboard around class size, et cetera. And so I'm imagining that there are some colleagues in the room who come from a similar place. Like, I'm pretty sure this is a good idea to do, but I don't have a rigorous pedagogy around it. And so since then, over the past 2 years, I've been researching pedagogies for academic speaking, and Craig and I have built this website that you see on the slide, speaking.arts.ubc.ca. And this is a web resource to support both teaching and learning. And one goal that we had in building the website is to align pedagogies for speaking with established writing pedagogies, particularly writing pedagogies that take EDI approaches through a focus on demystifying expectations, linguistic social justice, basically not being a grammar police, focusing on a writing in the disciplines approach. So this is sort of language that comes out of writing studies, but I think you can, if you're not in that field, sort of extrapolate that when we police grammar in writing, maybe in listening as well, we discriminate against certain students who don't have, for example, English as a first language. So Craig's going to tell you more about this site in a few minutes, and you can see some of the screenshots there. But I want to dip briefly into the site in order to set up our topic, which is about equitable and critical evaluation of student speaking. Part of what we've been doing over the past 2 years as we built the site is talking to students about their experiences giving presentations. As many of you are aware, students bring a lot of anxiety to public speaking. I saw that come up on the Jamboard as well. And some of that anxiety has to do with how they're going to be assessed. And so I'm going to play you a short video here. It's about 1.5 minutes where students this is from our website. So one of the things we have on the website is student reflection videos, students talking about different topics you can see on the slide here. And I'm going to play just part of the Talking Through Nerves video, and you can hear students talking about some of the things that make them particularly nervous in oral presentations.
Giving presentations makes me incredibly nervous too. And I think it probably stems from the fact that since I'm still an undergraduate student, my techniques and ideas may not be as refined as of yet.
I've been doing presentations for quite some time, and I still feel a decent amount of anxiety with them, where I'll tend to, I'll start to develop a stutter, and I'll start speaking faster if I'm worried that I haven't prepared enough, or if I'm unprepared in any way, shape, or form.
One of my biggest fears is just being monotone. When I feel like there's like a lot of structure to a presentation, sometimes my head just goes into like, read what's on the slide and give a little bit of explanation. So I find that I get very monotone sometimes. And like, that's my fear, like the audience isn't engaging with what I'm saying. And they're like, oh, when will this get over with? Or they don't understand what I'm saying, or what I think is like, I guess even scarier is if they ask a question and either I don't understand it or I won't be able to answer it.
Presentations make everyone nervous. I think that's a natural part of presenting. If you're in front of a lot of people, there's always this inherent fear of being judged. But I think the way I've gotten over it, like throughout the years, is realizing that people aren't judging you that harshly.
Yeah. But I also think that sharing ideas is the basis of academia, and everyone has the right to participate. And unless you share, you won't be able to inspire new ideas.
Okay, so I'll stop it there, but also sort of including a plug. If you're interested, you can check out the site and watch more of the videos. Some really wonderful stuff that the students share, and they also share some other wisdom around how they start their presentations and how they overcome these nerves, et cetera, et cetera. But for now, I'm going to try to find my slides again. I'm not really sure how you, maybe this button. Well, let's see. I'm trying to get it back. Oh, here we go. This is going to be what we want. Slideshow. Okay. So what I heard in that video is actually two students voicing two kinds of concerns. So on the one hand, you see anxiety around developing a stutter, speaking too fast, monotone delivery, boring the audience. One student said there's a fear of being judged by the audience. And these are all concerns or what we might call performance. There's also some concerns around the content of the presentation. So being unprepared, the audience not understanding, being unable to answer questions. But what's interesting to me is the way that you can kind of understand these two kinds of concerns. And because in doing some of the research around public speaking anxiety, we came across something called the performance communication continuum by a scholar, communication scholar, Michael Motley, who also works with some other co-authors. And you can see how the student concerns in these two categories map onto this continuum that Motley writes about, where he talks about how the anxiety around public speaking comes when we worry about the performance aspects of speaking, when we understand public speaking as analogous to the performances of Olympic figure skaters and concert pianists, when we worry that the audience is hypercritically focused on our every move. And in his work, what he does is he actually tries to convince people with PSA to move away from that orientation toward a communication orientation, where they can actually sort of only think about the communication of their content. So the primary objective to be to sharing information or ideas. And so we believe that in academia, we're sort of like, this is what we're interested in anyway, right? Like we're here to share knowledge, share our positions, make knowledge together. And it's really not like figure skating, right? If you fall down, you can get back up again and keep talking, as exhibited by my many, slips with the slideshow here today. I think that I'm still getting my message across. So we see that in the academy, there's sort of a perfect place to encourage students to think about the communication element. And when we do that, we are also providing a more equitable space where what we're not worried about are things that are beyond a student's control, like the way they speak, the way they present themselves physically. And this fits into the broader equity work that Craig and I have been doing. This is just a quote from an article that we published last summer, which talks about how just going to read some of this on the slide here, how the performance orientation, which I just explained, is especially troubling in the classroom setting, where it can be linked to what writing scholars have called profoundly exclusionary pedagogies, in which students are judged for being deficient in ways beyond their control. And I'm going to skip down to the second paragraph here. Classmates and instructors who have internalized that a successful speaking performance includes smiling, making eye contact, and connecting with one's audience may undervalue the presentations of neurodiverse students who do not exhibit these behaviors. So those are things that we can start to reflect on. As Margaret Price's work on disability shows, academic values, including presence, participation, and collegiality, contribute to the construction of a rigid, elitist, hierarchical, and inhumane academic system. So inviting us to rethink the sort of values that we put on our relationships and which students are sort of better suited and not better suited to exhibit those qualities. Furthermore, such norms are built into the resources our students use. So for instance, if you look at textbooks and other resources that teach public speaking, there's a discussion around voice and dress that will privilege cisgendered bodies. So we're expecting you to dress in a certain way that conforms to our gender expectations. Sometimes this maps on to sort of that the imagined speaker is a white male. So you can see how the emphasis on performance and the way we grade it, which is what Craig's going to get to in 1 second here, can produce some of these inequitable conditions.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'll take up, I'm going to start, I'll talk a little bit more about anxiety, return to the question of anxiety. Moberly, do you mind moving the slide ahead for me? Yeah, and from there, I wanted to talk about anxiety briefly and the kind of scholarly research on anxiety as a way to set up our conversation about assessment more specifically. So yeah, as we saw in the video that Moberly shared, student anxieties around presenting run very high. For us, we've kind of gone back and forth a little bit. Anxiety, we understand, is a bit of a fraught metric, since it's often used to mean the opposite of just confidence, of being confident. So that need to appear confidence can be one of those problematic imperatives of the performance paradigm we're trying to get away from. But at the same time, instilling a real confidence in students' abilities to navigate scholarly speaking situations, we think, is an important learning outcome. And surveys consistently show that students see speaking as an especially nerve-wracking task. So one study shows that 61% of students rank fear of public speaking as a top 3 source of anxiety. It's only behind death and financial problems. So you can see that it's something that really strikes fear, I guess, into students' hearts. Formal academic presentations seem to only intensify this general anxiety that students feel about speaking. And one thing I want to point out is this can actually decrease the presentation's utility as an assessment. So the scholarly literature here shows us that assessment anxiety can be a significant hindrance to student learning. So they're too anxious to actually get anything out of the assessments. And one survey out of the UK found that 80% of students report that, quote, oral presentations were a source of social anxiety impacting on learning and well-being. Just could you just skip to the next slide for me, please? So research also suggests that the performance paradigm's values influence these negative attitudes towards oral presentations. So a 2021 qualitative study on student fears student fears about oral presentations and public speaking found that the most commonly reported anxiety was around audience responses, including a prevalent fear of being judged. And the same study notes that many students were afflicted by the related anxiety around perfectionism. So this manifests as a fear of making a mistake. Other studies reiterate a point that Moberly has already made, which is that these anxieties are even more pronounced amongst equity-seeking groups. So non-native English speakers describe the additional pressures they feel, where another study shows also that those who identify as female are more likely to feel unconfident in their voice. So we can see then that the performance paradigm's values not only contribute to the speaking anxiety, but also help to distribute that anxiety along lines of inequity. Moreover, for many students, these performance-related anxieties can distract from the pedagogical purpose of oral assessments. So a study of first-year students' assessment anxieties across different tasks saw students ranking the oral presentation as the most anxiety-inducing assessment, and these same students also ranked it as the lowest in terms of educational value. Sorry, I've just realized this information is on the next slide too. So for this group of students at least, then the academic presentation is a high risk and low reward task. And we believe that a shift away from the performance paradigm can help reverse these perceptions, leading students to really hopefully appreciate the pedagogical value of speaking assessments while lowering the unpleasant affects that speaking in the classroom can evoke, the bad feelings that students are associating with speaking. We think this begins with with us as instructors explaining to students why they're being asked to give presentations and sharing clear criteria for how their presentations will be assessed. And students also want this direct instruction. So one study out of Brazil found that 89% of undergraduate students would like public speaking instruction, public speaking courses. And in another qualitative study, one student interviewee summarized what I think we can take as a sort of general student attitude. Their response was, "Show us how." And yet, in a recent review of the literature and oral presentation pedagogy and assessment, the authors identified that oracy is often taken for granted. It's not really something that is being taught directly in the classrooms. So, Moberly, now I'm going to just move on to the site if you want to switch windows and kind of try to follow along as I describe the different parts of it. So to help with scholarly speaking pedagogy, we've created the resource that Moberly has already previewed for you, the PASS, that's the Precedents Archive for Scholarly Speaking. And it's a website we built to help students prepare for academic presentations. We'll give you a quick tour here. So at the heart of the site, you will find a video archive of wonderful, we're very lucky to have this growing collection of UBC undergraduate student presentations that we've recorded from a multitude of different disciplines. So the idea here is we offer these videos as precedents, as examples for undergraduate students to learn from. So it's kind of like the sample essays that many of us probably, or sample assignments that many of us offer our students. These are going to be sample presentations. The site, however, encourages users to engage with these videos critically, asking users to consider what they see that might be helpful for their own presentations or what maybe doesn't quite work for them, what they might have to do differently. So in addition to these full-length presentation videos, we also have prepared a series of student guides, thank you, which offer overviews of some key components of academic presenting. So here we're drawing, like Moberly mentioned, on writing pedagogy and scholarship, and specifically the writing and the disciplines approach, by highlighting what we might think of as the key moves that scholars make while working within various scholarly speaking genres. So these guides also, each one will also feature compilation videos showing different approaches to each of these moves. So if you want to learn how to position your argument here, you can see there's a video here that usually 1 to 3 minutes, just giving different examples of people doing the same kind of thing, but in slightly different ways. And finally, there's that collection of interviews that we've already dipped into a little bit here, talking with student presenters. Just one thing we've learned from our own work and from the research we've done as well is that so many student concerns about scholarly speaking are, again, affective. So they're feelings-based, they're experiential. So we thought it would be important to let students hear from their peers, from peer presenters, about their feelings and about their experiences giving presentations. So I'll switch back to slides now. I think that's kind of our overview of the site. We'll try the next slide out and see what's there for us. So throughout the site, the student-facing messaging is consistent. So we're trying to shift student thinking away from that performance paradigm. But in creating the site, we also found ourselves reflecting a lot on our own teaching practice. And from early on, we sort of we've kind of flagged assessment as an area that would eventually need our additional attention. And that's where we're getting to now. So I'm so glad we're all here to chat about it. So in short, we're kind of just realized that unless students know that their instructors will be assessing their presentations using what we could think about as a communication-oriented criteria, communication-oriented evaluation, student buy-in for the message of the site, for our message, would be limited. So if a student uses our resource to prepare their presentation, only to lose, 10% for not making the right eye contact with the instructor. They'll not only feel misled by our instruction, but they'll also have some of their worst fears about scholarly speaking and maybe about themselves as scholarly speakers confirmed. So what we want to do then is try to find a way to align the instruction and the assessment of scholarly speaking within this new paradigm that we're trying to sketch. So we've got some preliminary principles that are guiding our thinking on this that I'll go through. Just 3 principles here for communication-oriented oral assessment design. And these principles will also help inform some of the comments we'll get to once we move on at the end of the presentation to the maybe thorniest part of oral presentation pedagogy, and that would be grading. How do we grade? So the next slide, please. Our first principle encourages discipline and genre-specific assessments. So here, Marion Heron tells us that oracy involves more than just skills. It requires a recognition of genre, register, appropriacy, and diversity of academic speaking contexts. So again, writing pedagogy scholarship has taught us that that teaching students to recognize, adopt, and adapt disciplinary and genre norms can allow them to easily meet the needs of academic audiences. And we want to encourage students to recognize that their oral presentations should similarly be responsive to the needs of a particular audience and show them the disciplinary and genre norms that can serve as shortcuts towards effective oral communication. And this approach, I think, reiterates for students the pedagogical value of oral assessment, as students can recognize the role that presentations play in this broader apprenticeship into academic culture. Moreover, communicating in our assignment descriptions that we are teaching and assessing learnable knowledge instead of innate public speaking skills can help reduce student anxiety. And in our own, we've been doing some surveying with our project as well. And one trend we've noticed in the data we've received so far is that many students in our course, we're at 76 as of right now, report that the question was that they feel less anxious knowing the instructor would evaluate the presentation from a communication orientation rather than judging their performance. Let's move on to the next slide here. So this focus on learnable genre knowledge brings me to the second principle. That's what we want to promote a scholarly speaking pedagogy that distributes assessment across that process of gaining and demonstrating scholarly speaking competence. So here again, we aim to reduce student anxiety by taking some of the grading weight off the presentation. So in my own classes last term, I had a research symposium presentation assignment, and that was worth a total of 12% of each student's overall grade, but only 5% of that grade actually came from the presentation itself. Students also completed pre and post assignment or post presentation reflection activities. These were worth 2% each. And this strategy is supported by a 2016 study that indicated that the first year student who completed pre and post public speaking exercises and assessments identified greater feelings of satisfaction and less fear, indecision, and confusion. And these assignments, so I think they serve a pedagogical rather than just a therapeutic purpose. So the pre-reflection activity was particularly helpful for introducing students to the norms of academic presentation genres and encouraging them to think about how they could use them in their own presentations when they're trying to anticipate what their specific audience will need. Just move on to the next slide, and the last kind of a principle I'll talk about here before we open things up to some discussion. So in my class, the other 3% of the students' grades came from their participation in-person and online discussions about their peers' presentations. So they were assessed on the quality of the feedback that they offered to peers in a couple of different venues. So each student then received quite a bit of ample feedback from their instructors and their peers, which they were then able to take into account when they were developing their arguments and finishing. It was actually, I had them present on the same topics that they were working on for their term papers. So the final post-presentation reflection activity ask them to think about how their experience with the presentation impacted their larger research process. And this brings me then to that final principle I want to talk about. We want to integrate presentations into the students' learning about the academic research process. So that's rather than treating the oral presentation as just a standalone assessment that's completely disconnected from the rest of their coursework, which is often, in our case at least, writing based. So in this, we concur with Gregory Nash's call for a constructively aligned curriculum, wherein teachers and curriculum designers should design public speaking assessment items only if the content and presentation style required are central to the discipline and field, and if opportunities for the learning the skills are incorporated into the teaching and learning design. So for professional academics, scholarly presentations, conference papers, for example, are seen as both, I guess, standalone genres and as part of a broader research program. And we want our undergraduate scholarly speaking pedagogy and assessment to also recognize both of these roles. So this proposal recalls Hanya Salter-Dvorak's oral presentation sandwich assignment, which required students to give an oral presentation between the first and final drafts of the essay. In this case, though, the presentation is reduced to a tool for improving writing, and Salter-Dvorak recognized that this limited its efficacy for students. They were just more concerned about preparing their presentations themselves rather than just refining the arguments for their term papers. We want to ask, so what might an assessment look like that refuses to separate out these two elements? One that, what's an assessment going to look like that won't subordinate the presentation to the essay? And we want to start thinking here, and we'll move on here to our discussion about how grading can encourage students to understand the oral presentation as an act that communicates both genre and subject knowledge. So yeah, we do have a few, now we're just going to take we'll open things up for discussion a little bit. Before we move on to our discussion of grading, Moberly has a few rubrics we're going to share on the screen here that we've found in the scholarly literature. And I'm going to put some questions here. I'll ask some questions about them and put them in the chat, but we'll just open up and talk about maybe what we see here, what we recognize, what you might do in your own class that's similar, or what you think you do differently that you'd like to, or what could be done differently in our grading as well. So we'll just start off here. You can have a second to look at these, and I'd just love to hear your initial thoughts. So have you seen or used rubrics like this? What problems do you see with them, and how do you think we could address them with evaluation or assessment rubrics, criteria, whatever ways you might think we would address them?
I was surprised to see correct pronunciation as something emphasized here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that is something we see pretty consistently, actually, in these rubrics that we've found. It is surprising, and again, just that word "correct" really seems to be limiting in terms of, I guess, what the actual speech we're encountering in our classes looks like. It seems like it's kind of beside the point as a point of emphasis here.
And you also see the word normal used a lot, which I think we might bristle at as well. Even if it is, I see it here on the left-hand one about organization, but I still don't know what normal organization might be. Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to share the other one that I had as well? Is that on the slide?
Is it on here?
I think I added it.
Oh, there it is. Okay, perfect. Properly.
Yeah, so here we get some similar. This one even says, did they use the English language properly? Adequate eye contact, speak loudly enough. So one thing we might notice here, I'll move on to the next question then. This rubric, or all these rubrics we look at, seem to really evaluate speaking as speaking, presentations as presentations, with sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to presentation, to public speaking. Whereas the field we work in, the writing pedagogy, we've really been pushing to think about how expectations change across disciplines. So one thing I'm really curious about, that we were kind of curious about, is we're kind of working on this multidisciplinary project, is to know what's missing from these rubrics that's maybe specific to this discipline that you teach in. What are some of the expectations for the discipline you're teaching in that aren't covered by these rubrics we've seen so far?
So I work in healthcare, occupational therapy and occupational science. And we actually had one presentation where we asked that you don't use PowerPoint or minimize the use of PowerPoint, because we really wanted it to be like skills based, or demonstrating something that you learned that you could show through actual demonstration. So that was really, I thought, a great way of trying to get students to think differently.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Again, it seems like an odd, when all of these are saying the correct use of visual materials, what does that mean? When the correct use means no visual materials, I guess, or a more hands-on demonstration, it doesn't seem to fit. Thanks for that. Stephen, I see your hand up there.
I teach an upper level chemistry class dealing with metalloprotein, metalloenzyme structure, and we do oral presentations in that class. A lot of what you're dealing with there is visual representation of objects that you can't actually see because they're too small. And so grappling with that symbolic representation, putting something on the screen that communicates the information you're trying to communicate effectively, while also speaking to the imaginary object that is spinning around on the screen beside you in a way that makes sense, is often a challenge. And I always try to emphasize to my students in that course, particularly, to try to get away from a giant wall of text that you will narrate and put more visuals on the screen, because you are dealing with a language that isn't just verbal and isn't just written. It is also visual and symbolic. But that's a new complicated disciplinary language that everyone is also learning, and it requires often a lot more expertise than students at that level have to do in a way that's really effective.
Absolutely, that sounds very challenging. But yeah, I also just like our two examples here. One was, I guess both of them were looking at very disciplinary specific ways of using just visual materials specifically for that showed just this kind of disparity across disciplines that's really not captured by these rubrics. So hopefully that we'll have to kind of keep moving through our questions here, but even those two great contributions, I think, point to just how much disparity there is between different disciplinary approaches, and how inadequate a lot of these existing rubrics might be. They're kind of one-size-fits-all criteria. One last question, I guess, I wanted to ask before we kind of move on to a couple of solutions we've been working with, is one thing we've been pushing for here is to push away from the performance values, we'll call them. But we do recognize that sometimes problems might arise from ignoring some of the basic public speaking skills. So students who speak too quickly or who speak too softly to be understood can pose problems for audience comprehension. We've all been in presentations where we're kind of straining forward to be able to hear what's being said, or just thinking, oh, I wish they would just slow down a bit. So one thing we're thinking about is ways that we can encourage students to be mindful of these performance aspects without kind of reinscribing that harmful performance paradigm. So I'm just wondering how people have kind of ideas for suggesting teaching these sort of presentation skills without emphasizing them in a way that brings on greater anxiety. We're kind of wanting to limit the anxiety instead of encouraging it. So just curious if anybody has any strategies that they've used in their teaching. Practice. Yeah, that's so important. Thank you for that, Jennifer. I think that is so important to remind students that this is something they should be practicing before they get up in front of the class to do it. I think that's a great way to do it. Timing themselves is something I also encourage too. Yeah. Smaller groups, yeah, and I think that comes back to some of those things I saw on the Jamboard about with familiar people about, I guess, peer evaluation as well. One thing I've thought about and I've seen people trying out is sort of a trial run of the presentation that is almost like a peer feedback practice session where they give their presentation to a smaller group, get some feedback on that. Again, it could be part of the assessment as well. You could make that, worth 1 or 2% of their overall grade. So I think that that's a great idea that you could, again, work into the assessment design itself, these practice sessions to kind of get them feeling confident and also just kind of pick out those stumbling points and figure out what it feels like to read. We all, I think, start reading 10% faster than we anticipated. Trying to keep up with the chat here a little bit. Backing up. Jennifer, I like that point too about the microphone, who anyone thinking they'll speak softly, because I like that. I think it's so important to make sure that we're accommodating students as well. And if that's kind of their natural voice, especially if it's something they think, I like that you said also they think they might speak too softly. If that's their impression, if that's giving them anxiety, why not just, if it's easy enough as it is in a lot of modern classrooms, just accommodate that and set them up with a microphone, for example. I think that's a great idea. Sorry, Laura, I saw you had the same idea. Thank you. Oh yeah, and I like this idea too from the group presentations too, finding different ways people can contribute. I saw that was a question in the Jamboard I was really interested in too, so maybe we'll wrap this session up so we have a bit more time for Q&A at the end. I want to come back to that question about group presentations because it's something Moberly and I haven't really worked on or thought about a lot, but I think it's really interesting. Oh, and Leon, I see your point here as well. Yeah, recording yourself is a great way to practice as well. So yeah, I think all these different practice strategies, and again, we can build them into the assessment, I think is a great way as part of that pre-presentation work to show students, that this process is there is a process to the presentation. It's not just kind of go up in front of the class and hope for the best. So the last thing we're going to wrap up talking about today, I see we are up against it in terms of time, but I've been talking for a while, so I'll rush through my part, and I'll hand it back over to Moberly. Just a couple things that we've kind of thought about in terms of grading. So one thing that I've tried to do is I've moved to a rubric that I used for my last presentation. That's I would call it criteria focused rather than skills focused. So as I already noted, that grade for the presentation is only worth a portion of the actual overall grade for the suite of presentation assignments. But even within that distribution of grades, I still wanted the assignment to align with, or the assessment rather, to align with a communication-oriented approach. So what I landed on here was a list of criteria. Each of them was individually assessed. I told them this is what was to be included in the presentation. So these are things they were all familiar from their writing practice. So introduction to the topic, identifying their discipline, share their research questions, compose a lit review, share their argument or their thesis, preview the evidence that they're going to be looking at. But in the instructions, what I said was that for each of these elements, students would be evaluated on evidence that they considered their audience's needs. So how, for example, would they think about doing a literature review in an oral presentation versus on the page? How would they do their citations aloud? So thinking then again about trying to encourage them and evaluate them for that ability to think about the specific classroom situation that they're in and how they could adapt their presentation to share the information most efficiently within that. So maybe I'll wrap that one up and I'll let Moberly take over with her talk about ungrading.
Okay, so yeah, I'll just chime in quickly with another. So the criteria focused route that Craig just talked about is one. Another route that I've been trying recently in my classroom is ungrading. This is something that is familiar to many of you. And in fact, I think there's experts in the room greater than I, but I'm just going to kind of define in a very general sense sort of the idea behind ungrading, labor-based grading, contract grading. There's, that's sort of, I'm just going to go quickly here, but basically the sort of principles are to emphasize the process over the product, to reward labor over quality. It's part of an anti-racist pedagogy because, and this is Asa Inoue saying, grading because it requires a single dominant standard is a racist and white supremacist practice. That kind of speaks to what I had a quote from him on the previous slide when I was talking about how we sort of, though many of us bring our white habitus to our expectations, right? This is what it should sound like. This is what it should look like. So instead, we're offering rewards for doing the work in the spirit that it is assigned, and we're attending to intrinsic motivation. So this is kind of, again, I'm not going into detail, but on grading, but the idea is emphasizing the process and rewarding people for the work that they're putting in. And so the way this hit the ground for me in a oral presentation I assigned just in the fall was I switched to a collect point system. So it wasn't evaluative, it was just points. So a point for staying in the time limit, a point for having an argument, a point for having a citation, a point for using I. This was something that we discussed in terms of joining the scholarly conversation. So my discipline is English literature. This is a discipline in which we use I. We talked about how when we're presenting, that's really important because you're sort of embodying your contribution to the conversation. This kind of speaks to the idea of thinking about the genre, thinking about the discipline. These were important parts of what we were learning. A point for attending when you weren't presenting. So we did presentations over 2 days, and I really wanted to make sure that people didn't just come on the day they were presenting. And a point for asking a question in the question period. So we don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of how well this worked. I will say that the last one worked amazingly for generating discussion. I had every hand up, and we had the most beautiful discussions I've ever had. I've tried other strategies in the past for discussion. I've tried assigning questioners, and it's all felt really forced. The point really worked amazingly, but I didn't have enough points. It kind of backfired on me because we had this beautiful question period, but then I didn't have enough time to give everybody the points that they needed. So that is going to take a bit more refining, but you get the general idea, which is just to move away from saying, this is my, my evaluation, but you came, you did the assignment as required. You were sort of part of the conversation. The other thing this does, and we didn't get a chance to talk about this too much today, but I do just want to flag the importance of really cultivating the listener. When I did a focus group with students around their experiences giving presentations, a lot of them said that the worst part was the other students feeling like they weren't listening. They were on their phones, they were not there, they were distracted. So really to improve the presentation sort of quality or experience, part of it is improve the listening audience and teaching students how to ask questions, teaching them what I talk to my students about listening, what it means to be a listener. So that would be something that it actually worked. It proved a little tricky, but it also worked really well for alleviating my own stress around I don't want to penalize them for certain performance aspects. I don't have to. I just sort of released myself from that obligation. So we have left ourselves just a few minutes, which I see there's been some conversation in the chat. If anyone wants to add a question in the chat or put up their hand, we have a couple more minutes to loop back to any pressing ideas or questions that may have come up. Does anyone want to ask anything before we wrap up, or we can return to something? Stephen.
I appreciate the distinction of the paradigms that you're coming at and shifting from performance to communication. I'm I was hoping you can offer maybe some sort of underlying principles to help guide instructors thinking about how you're making that determination and sort of where to draw the line, right? I mean, we've spoken about some, cultural or some behavioral things that maybe you want to move away from trying to emphasize. But if a presenter doesn't speak clearly and loudly, no one can hear them. And it doesn't matter how good what they're saying is, if we can't understand what they're saying, nobody has communicated any information, right? So they're not so easily disentangled, I guess. How do I draw the line between what is truly effective communication practice and what is merely biases of my own interpretation of what makes a good performance? Because I don't think they can be completely separated, can they?
No, you've hit on it. I mean, we come up against this challenge precisely.
Okay.
I mean,
good. So you're also struggling with this point. That's excellent.
We're very aware of it. I think the key is what we're trying to imagine is how you bring them together in ways that students have control over.
Right.
And
okay.
Craig, do you want to jump in? I think maybe there's an example you could share that.
Yeah. Sorry, this was on one of the slides there a while back that I had to skip. Unfortunately, maybe we could pull it back up as an example. But yeah, for me, it comes down to kind of. I think one way we can do it is through the kind of feedback we're giving, how we present formative feedback. So even if we are commenting, like you're saying, on something that might at first blush seem like a performance part of the presentation, we can find language that makes it a communication issue. So again, it doesn't become a critique of the speaker as a speaker. Instead, it becomes something they can adapt to better meet the audience's needs. So the example I had was, instead of "you spoke too quickly," I would write something like, "As an audience member, I had trouble following the logic, connecting the different parts, slowing down your speech, repeating key ideas, offering visual support," giving strategies they can use instead of, if you say you speak too quickly, they'll probably become more anxious and maybe even start speaking more quickly. So again, just that's one strategy I've come up with, is sort of trying to use.
So the feedback moves away from behavior and refocuses back on the impact on the communication.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah,
that's good. Okay.
And I think the other thing I like about that example too is that there's options there.
Yeah.
Right? Because the student will get nervous. I know I speak too quickly. How am I going to slow down? Well, okay, here's some multiple strategies. You can still speak quickly, but if you write in your script that you're going to repeat something, that will help us. So there's the awareness of the audience, and there's also the sort of multiple strategies, and it's less of a critique of the student. I see the time, so we can wrap up. But Jennifer, we'd love to hear your question. Craig and I can certainly stay on, but I would say that anyone who has to go is very welcome to go. And thank you so much for the conversation. And please do check out our resource in your teaching, and we hope that it's useful to you.
Moberly, maybe just put the if you can go to the last slide and put our emails up again.
Oh yeah.
A couple of people had asked about. I said I could share an assignment. If you email me, write down my email address there, I will be sure to send that along. So thank you.
Oh, that's interesting, Jennifer, about the like having sort of multiple experiences, and then it dilutes the my authority, and this is how I'm critiquing you. Yeah, interesting. Thanks, everybody.